Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is November 8th, 2017, and we are continuing our coverage on Mormon Stories of inappropriate interviews with Mormon leadership about matters of sexuality. This is now the third interview in our series. We've interviewed Paul, and we interviewed, I think she went by the name Anne in the interview. Sometimes we have to do these interviews anonymously because of the sensitive nature of the issues involved. But we're now continuing that that series, and we're so excited to be doing this again to remind people. This is following up Bishop Sam Young's petition that he started. Sam Young is a childhood friend of mine. He and my dad were business partners a long time ago, but Sam Young, former Mormon bishop, has now created a petition for people to sign to try and get the Mormon Church to stop interviewing 12-year-olds and teenagers, girls and boys alone in a closed room about matters of sexuality, shaming people over masturbation and pornography and sexual experimentation. For a number of reasons. And we're laying out those reasons in this series of interviews. And we just want to encourage everyone to sign the petition. If you can, share it and do all you can to be a spokesperson in your wards and stakes and to protect your children so that we do all that we can to prevent these sorts of abuses from going on. But now we are doing part 3 in our interview. And we're really excited to have with us Anna. Anna is going to be talking about her relationship. And she's also going to be speaking on behalf of Tyler, which is the name she's using for her husband, to talk about their experiences dealing with Mormon leadership over private interviews dealing with sexuality. So I want to thank everyone for joining us live on Facebook Live. We really do want to encourage everyone to please make comments and questions, because it makes these interviews more interesting to have them be a little bit interactive. So we want to welcome everyone who's joined us so far. We've got a good audience already building. And without any further ado, I want to welcome Anna to Mormon Stories Podcast. And Anna, you've decided not to use video for this interview. Is that right?
Correct.
Tell us why.
I have some family members that are still very involved in the church and close friends, and just kind of want to keep the video portion out of it.
No, that's fine. No, that's great. So we totally understand. And these are totally sensitive issues. So we're just grateful that you're willing to be with us. And we'll just ask our listeners to please forgive us that you don't have full video, but you get full audio. And just understand that sometimes we're going to have to not show video just for the sake of sensitivity.
Yes, thank you for allowing me to do that. I appreciate it.
Of course. All right. So why don't you begin by just telling us just a bit about your Mormon story, just so that we get a sense. You don't have to tell us about anything past the interviews. Just give us a sense for your history and upbringing in the church, if you'd like.
Okay. I grew up in a very religious LDS family. We went to church every Sunday. We were always in the front row. My dad was on Bishoprics. We had pictures of Joseph Smith and Jesus in the house, and we read scriptures every night. Anyway, it was super religious. My story goes back to when I was 23, newly engaged, and trying to get worthy to go to the temple to be married. And Tyler and I had some transgressions that we needed to see a bishop for.
Now we're calling those transgressions now.
Yes, right.
Maybe what I would want to call them is normal and sometimes even healthy sexual exploration and experimentation. Do you want to speak to that point at all? Like whether or not you think it was healthy, whether or not you think that it's even damaging for them to be referred to as transgressions?
I think it was totally healthy and totally normal.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
when you say transgressions, it's how the church referred to it, right?
Lingo.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Perfect.
So when we were dating, I was living in an apartment and so was he. We would go to church here and there, but mostly inactive, kind of hopping wards and things like that. And I knew once we got engaged that I would be moving home until we got married. And so I went to this bishop in a home ward because I knew eventually I would be there. This bishop, we had been in a ward when I was younger, like a child. We had been in a ward with him. So he knew me at a young age. He knew my parents very well, and he knew my sister really well because it was actually my sister's ward. So he knew my family super well. So one thing I want to say is I had never done anything serious enough to go confess to a bishop before. It was my first time. I had no idea what to even really expect. So I just kind of wanted to lay that out before I get into the whole interview that I had with him.
What makes you feel like you want to say that? Just curious, just out of curiosity.
Because I didn't know, because obviously something inappropriate happened and my interaction with him was really awful. And I didn't know at the time that some of the things he said were really not appropriate and totally wrong and really abusive, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you were just new to the whole game.
I was, and like I said, I was going in, didn't know how any of this was going to go. Didn't really have any friends or any family that I had talked to before that had been through a confession or repentance process. So I didn't really know what to expect other than, you're not going to be able to take the sacrament. That's about all I knew.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So
I met with him, and Tyler went with me.
Now this was you guys getting ready to get married in the temple and
yes. So
that
it was
sort of thing?
It was to go in and confess and repent and, get married in the temple. And Tyler went with me. We didn't know at the time if we could go in together, and I don't know if that's something that they allow, but he wouldn't let him come in.
Mm-hmm.
So I went in alone, and I just pretty much said, we have broken the law of chastity, and we've, been touching underneath clothes. And so then I don't really know how we got to this point, but then he started asking me a bunch of questions, details. So, he asked if, we had masturbated each other. He asked if I touched myself when Tyler was there or if he wasn't there. He asked if we had oral sex. He asked if I just received or if I reciprocated. So, I'm answering all these questions. And
so this is like, how are you feeling about these questions as he's asking you?
I feel like I want to crawl in a hole and die.
Why?
I think my face was beet red. I don't think I knew really what to expect. I wasn't sure if I could just get away with, saying, well, we've broken this law of chastity and I guess I tried to put it as mildly as I could, to him, like we've been touching without clothes on, and, for him to really get into the details of it, I was shocked.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm answering these questions, and he proceeds to say, did you climax? And I answered, and, he said, did you climax every time you had sexual interaction? And I just wanted to die when he asked me that. It felt so wrong at the time. And I was thinking in my head, well, if I did, is it more of a sin if I did? So that was super uncomfortable.
Did
He
you
also,
get the feel, and you would only be speculating, but did you get the feeling that he was just doing his job, that these were questions he had been asked to ask, or that maybe in some way he was actually getting gratification out of,
no,
your answers?
I think he was getting gratification, and I think he was getting gratification off the fact that I was so uncomfortable. He could tell that I was uncomfortable with the way I was speaking and the things I was doing physically. I was shrinking in my chair. I was red in the face. I really do think that he was getting off on that, so to speak.
Okay, that must have felt really bizarre to have a trusted priesthood leader making you feel that way.
Yeah, it was devastating, actually.
Because what difference does it make if you climaxed or not, if you gave or received?
Right.
Is any of that necessary in the repentance process?
I
Would any outcome change? Right.
Right.
What possibly could the Lord need him to know
Yeah.
that detailed information for? Right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And he proceeded to ask me how Tyler and I had learned how to do all these things together. He asked me if we had watched pornography, and he waited for me to answer, like, how did you guys even learn about these things? And I was baffled. I didn't even, like, you don't leave junior high without knowing what certain things are.
Right.
And I think that's even what I said to him. And honestly, it's a natural thing. Now I know that now. It's not like you're looking things up online to do together.
Yeah.
So
like that would be bad. Like to
right.
educate yourself would be a terrible thing, right?
Yeah. Yep. And he did ask me if it was all Tyler's idea. It was all him, and I said no. And I took, my responsibility for it. So that kind of was the confession aspect of it. And then he kind of went into the whole chastising part of the discussion we had. He proceeded to tell me that he'd known my family for years. He knew my parents, knew that we were righteous, faithful family, and he, for word said, how did you fall this far? How did you get this low?
How did that make you feel?
I felt awful. I felt awful to begin with before even going in there. And then just to be hit in the face with this, it was unbearable, really.
Mm-hmm.
He went on to ask about Tyler, his background, his family, his religious background. Tyler did not go on a mission. And when I told him that, he said he is going to be a bad father. He's going to be a bad husband, for that reason. And I said, well, Tyler's father is a convert to the church. He didn't go on a mission. He's served in many callings, including branch president, and he is a wonderful father. And he said, well, he needs to consider himself lucky then, because I think he was just trying to say, like, men that don't go on missions, it's almost impossible for them to be good husbands and good fathers. So not only is he getting into this private stuff, he's also attacking my fiance at this point, and his family, really. So then he moves on to how do you know he's the right one for you? How do you know he's the right one to be married to? It's a really important decision. And I said, well, he's my best friend. We've known each other for years. And then I think I was I think I was feeling pressure. I think I said I prayed about it, even though I probably didn't. And he said, well, it's impossible for you to know that it's the right decision for you because the Spirit has left you entirely. You don't have the Spirit with you at all. So, you know, and then
I just hate this idea that if you don't act a certain way, that if there's a God, he's going to withdraw the support that you need when you need it most, you know?
Right. And that's the whole thing. Like I had been taught my entire life about repentance and the atonement and never done anything. And then I'm going in there and thinking with what he's saying, none of this applies to me. I've been doing this everything right my entire life, and how does this not apply to me? That's how I was feeling. So he kind of moved on to what I'm going to call his punishment phase.
Okay.
Because he didn't there was no talk of forgiveness. There was no talk of Christ's love for me, making mistakes, nothing. There was nothing like that. He refused to give me a timeline on when we could possibly, you know, move forward and go to the temple. One of the things he made me do is he made me move out of my apartment immediately. So the next day I moved out of my apartment and moved home. And
that's like real exceeding your boundaries.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really messing with your life at that point.
And you have to understand that I came from a family where you don't criticize a bishop. You don't talk badly about bishops. It's wrong.
Yeah, no evil speaking of the Lord's anointed, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he also wanted us to take a break. He set rules and said we could only see each other once a week and we could only call each other every other day. And at this point, at this point we'd actually been dating for a year.
And you're how old? You're in your 20s.
I'm 23. Yeah. Yeah. And you're engaged and you're seeing each other all the time. And so it was just, at this point, I'm thinking, this is crazy, but he's the bishop, so I'm going to do what he asks me.
He speaks for God, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, of course, we have follow-up interviews, because he has to see how we're doing. And after the initial interview, I went into the other ones feeling really positive because we were doing well. And every time I would go in, he would break me down somehow, and I would leave sobbing, crying. The first thing he would ask me in follow-up interviews is, have you messed up yet? What have you done wrong? Even though we hadn't done anything wrong, he refused to move forward and let us set a wedding date, even though we had been, quote, transgression-free. Eventually, actually, Tyler's bishop said we could set a date, and I told my bishop that. And he just like flipped out. He said, well, I'm going to get his bishop on the phone and just make sure that Tyler's being completely honest with everything that happened. And
I mean, that's just a perfect illustration of the lack of inspiration, that you could have two different bishops totally giving completely different experiences and then coming to totally different conclusions. If they're supposed to be inspired by God, why aren't they in sync? Why do they have to get on the phone call and try and persuade each other, right?
Right. And that, you bring up a good point, because that was a little hard for me because I was having such a different experience than Tyler was. His was positive. And I wasn't angry about it. I wasn't angry at Tyler for it. I could not wrap my head around it. I couldn't. So,
and I just have to say that without exception so far, the female always gets it worse than the male in front of these ecclesiastical leaders.
Really?
Oh, like I've even heard it where the woman gets excommunicated and the male barely gets disfellowshipped, and they were both in the adulterous relationship. Like that's an extreme, but without fail, somehow the patriarchy, and it makes sense, the patriarchy shames and mistreats the woman far greater than the man. Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry, keep going.
No, you're fine. So, we were finally able to set a date, and, he just made a comment like, you have one screw up and this entire deal is off the table. You're done, and just really negative, from the beginning to the end, nothing positive.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I really do feel like he was trying to break us up for some reason, which backfired on him a little bit because I think it only brought us closer,
Mm-hmm.
Taylor and I.
Sure.
So, anyway, the follow-up interviews continued, and they were always so negative, and I hadn't been doing anything wrong, and I gave up. Because it is hard. It is hard to not do those things when you're engaged, and I gave up. I just didn't care anymore, and pretty much I lied to the bishop and told him I hadn't done anything wrong on follow-up interviews so that I could get as far away from him as possible.
Mm-hmm.
There was at one point where I met with the stake president where I wanted to tell him kind of everything that had happened, but I was too afraid.
Are you saying that you just felt like he wasn't going to believe you no matter what, no matter how good you were, so you stopped trying to be, quote, good?
Pretty much.
And then just went back to the behavior you were engaging in and just lied about it. Is that what you're saying?
I felt like I was getting in trouble, almost like he was my dad or something. Like I was getting in trouble for not even doing anything wrong, for being good. And so when we did mess up again, I was like, there's no way I'm going to tell you. There's no way. I'm not going to go through that again.
So they set up the system where lying is the outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I do take responsibility for that. But we just wanted to do what we had to do to get away from him and move on. So we did end up getting married in the temple. We lied to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much from that point on, it started a faith crisis for me. I struggled for months after we got married about how I was treated and why. I know bishops are people. I know they mess up. But the way everything had went down, I felt like the atonement had failed me, like it didn't apply to me. So that just led to me asking these questions that I've never asked myself before. And ultimately, I've left the church. I don't believe in the church any longer.
So was this experience a part of your loss of faith in the church?
Yes.
Tell me how that worked for you.
So the way this bishop treated me is not the reason I left. What happened as I grew up, like I said, I grew up in a super religious family, but I never really took the time to think, do I really believe this? I just always said it. I know I did all the right things. I read my Book of Mormon, I prayed, but I never really sat down and thought, do I really, believe all this? So I think this experience just made me really take a step back and think, do I really, believe in this? And then I started hearing things, from various places about Joseph Smith and his history of things, and that really threw me for a loop. That one was hard. So
when you're being raked over the coals about sexuality, and then you find out what Joseph Smith did.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and like I said, we had a huge picture of Joseph Smith in my house growing up, and you know, he's put on a pedestal in the church. So after we were married for the first little while, I tried internally to want to go back to church. Cause I mean, we went to the temple, we never went back to church. But inside I was feeling really guilty, and I thought, well, you know, we should go back and talk to our bishop. But I just could not get myself to go back in and talk to another bishop. I had trust issues. I did.
Yeah, well, it makes sense.
So the whole process made me feel violated, really, and humiliated and ashamed. So it's, right now, I still look back on it and I get a little bit angry at myself for, I was young, you know, I shouldn't have put up with that. Whatever he was asking me to do, you know, the person I am now, I would have gotten up and walked out. So I do.
Okay, that explains your disclaimer at the beginning. It sounds like you have shame that you allowed yourself to be treated this way.
Yeah, I do. I really do. So I felt like I was a coward for not just sticking up for myself and for Tyler, and also for just, you know, saying, screw it. I don't care what my family or friends think about me not getting married in the temple. I'm just going to go do my own thing. I just wish I hadn't cared so much what people thought.
I hate the idea that you're blaming yourself for any of this, honestly.
Well, I just think that there's things that you're taught when you're young and the way you're raised in some families, you know, like I said, you don't criticize a bishop or, you know, have a different view, really. So yeah. Anyway, it caused the faith crisis, and then I just ended up, you know, I haven't been active in the church at all since all of that. So
how's Tyler been as a husband?
He's the same. We're in the same boat.
But I mean, the bishop predicting that he would not be a good husband or father.
Well, he was completely wrong, of course. He's a fantastic father and a wonderful husband. I knew he would be. And, you know, going on a mission does not determine in any way who you are or shape you as a person of who you're going to be in the future.
Right.
So, I mean, we've heard opposite stories of, you know, people going on missions and doing horrible things. So.
Yeah. How do you have a sense for how those experiences have affected you as an adult? Or do you even, I don't want to force anything there, but sometimes these types of experiences can have personal ramifications to your own mental health, to your own sense of empowerment or sexuality. And then they can also affect the marriage, frankly.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I do think that was hard, because after we got married, I was, you know, like, we're going to read scriptures every day. We're going to go back to church. And Tyler was not really on that same page. So that did cause some rift there. I just remember being done with that whole experience and thinking, I will never, ever let anybody treat me or make me feel like that again, ever. So, I mean, it just made me feel sad.
Yeah. Anything else about your story you want to tell before we kind of wrap up with some summaries or conclusions?
No, just other than I don't know enough about church processes now to know what they are doing in interviews like this. I don't know if it's still just the bishop, but I would hope they would change that. They need to have somebody else in the room, and I would love to see them bring a female in, just to have another view in the room. But I do realize that it is going to be a mindset, because there are people out there that are going to think, well, he's the bishop, and I'm not going to say anything because what he says goes, and I'm not going to say anything. So I do hope that there is going to be change with that. But I do know that in all cases it's not going to be helpful. But I would hope that there would be some, that having another person in the room would help people.
Absolutely. If not just a woman, like we talked about this last episode, ideally these sorts of things just wouldn't be in the domain of spirituality and religion. Number one, because often these issues are created by religion, and then second, they're made worse by the way religion handles these issues. But also, bishops and mission presidents aren't trained to deal with this kind of stuff. They're not mental health professionals.
Right.
And they often they not only create the problem and exacerbate it, they make it worse. So for all those reasons, let's just have them not talk about this stuff and talk about, personal spirituality and health and mental health and well-being and those sorts of things. But if they do still have them, then by all means have women counseling women, and not 40, 50-year-old bishops alone with 20-year-old women or 12-year-old girls or 12-year-old boys or 30-year-old men. Exactly. Because it's just inappropriate and egregious and damaging.
And I just think there's just an unbalance. They give bishops a lot of power. They give them a lot of ability to decide where they want to go with things. And I don't think I just think it's unbalanced.
Yeah, it is.
So
as you're thinking of any final things you want to say, I'll just read some comments from our listeners. Sean notes that it's ironic the way that your husband was treated for not serving a mission, because President Monson, President Uchtdorf, and President Eyring all never served missions. So that's Sean's point of view. Good Barry point. Says some bishops are out of control. The one in his ward is out of control. Plus his uncle never served a mission, and he is a bishop at this time. So that's thanks to Barry. Jordan says, this interview is making me sick. How horrible. Sorry, Jordan. It is not fun to listen to. Aubrey says, God is my judge. She's basically saying no man should be able to judge anyone's worth, right?
Right.
Chad writes, bishops judge based on their upbringing, experiences, and education. Their answers are as varied as their personalities. They may pray and hope to provide sound advice, but generally they feel they know what counsel to provide based upon their opinions and the church handbook. And and a lack of training, Chad, I would add, and just sort of like this unwritten order of things based on how they were treated by bishops and stake presidents, how they were trained verbally by bishops and stake presidents. And it's just this hodgepodge that needs to be regulated, because it's when bishops go rogue or when they just go off their own script, the results can be disastrous, right?
Yeah, it was almost like I'm going to throw this at her and see if she'll do it kind of thing. It really was a control, a power trip. That's what I think. Yeah,
and having more people in the room at a minimum can help reduce that power dynamic.
Exactly. Right? Yes.
Yeah. Joyce notes how ironic it is for the church leaders to be calling you a liar when the church lied to its members for centuries, I guess, or at least over a century. That's Joyce's point. Hannah writes, Anna could be me. Her story is very similar to mine. So we have, and Hillary writes, I had a similar experience. She also writes, God bless you, Anna. So,
and that's why I did this, because I know there's other people out there, and I just want people to know they're not alone.
Yeah. That's totally so important. That's one of the main benefits of these podcasts. People keep coming back because it helps them know they're not alone and they're not crazy, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Ashley writes, so many turds I know that served missions, and so many wonderful people that I know who didn't serve missions. So shout out to Ashley. She's a former Mormon Stories interviewee. Angela writes, I would never let my children meet with anyone in authority like that without someone else in the room. And that's something that came out in our last interview, that protect your children. Never let your children, never let yourself be alone with any Mormon leader behind closed doors. Just don't, it's not safe, you know?
Yeah.
I've even received reports in this series of bishops sexually molesting and abusing women. So that's the worst case scenario, but it's just not safe.
Do they have they changed things now with minors?
No.
No.
Bishops are still asking 12-year-old girls if they masturbate in 2017.
And in a room by themselves.
In a room by themselves. Boys too.
Wow.
Yep.
I thought that had changed.
No, and also missionaries, the church has just come out. There's a leaked memo on Mormon Leaks where the church is trying to raise the bar again because they're having so many missionaries come home. Mm-hmm. And so they're asking bishops to get more and more explicit when they talk to prospective missionaries, boys and girls, about what they've done sexually and not. So the memo, and I'll need to read this in an upcoming episode, but the memo actually says something to the effect of get as much detail as you possibly can. So the church is even encouraging more detail and more scrutiny, you know?
I don't understand that.
Yeah, I don't either. I think they think that if they can, they're trying to weed people out. Mm-hmm. So by getting as much detail as they can, I think they're in a way nudging bishops to turn more missionaries away because they're having missionaries return home in droves. Mm-hmm. And it's a huge problem in terms of management and expense for the church.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Let's see. Any other final comments? Let's see. Oh, Ashley says you learn in Young Women's the licked cupcake or the chewed gum metaphors. Did you have any of those sorts of metaphors affecting you in terms of your beliefs about yourself?
I think so. Because I had those same lessons growing up. I remember in high school, I think prom was coming up, and my leader had told a story about, or just said that having bare shoulders or a bare back would, really make whoever is your date really uncomfortable, and so I have
putting on the woman to keep a boy's thoughts pure and his hands where they should be.
And I have huge issues with that one because that just, let's put all the responsibility on the woman, So yeah, I would definitely say that has had some effect on me for sure.
Yeah. Joey writes, leaders like this are essentially absolute monarchs within their sphere of influence. Mm-hmm. That's true. Too much power. No checks on the power, right?
Exactly. That's exactly it.
And if you go to a stake president, he's just as likely to turn you back to the bishop, right?
And that's what I was afraid of. Yes.
Yeah. And you were scared because
I was.
You didn't. There's no recourse. There's no process for you to get due treatment, right?
Right. I didn't want to lie. I wanted to tell the truth. I didn't know how to get the help that I was looking for.
Right. Abraham writes, I had 3 bishops growing up and all 3 had wildly different punishments for the same sin. Thanks, Abraham. And that just shows how arbitrary this ecclesiastical bishop roulette is. Mm-hmm. You can get a bishop that punishes you for a year, and you can get a bishop that lets you off with not even a slap on the wrist, and it just totally is random,
Right. It's totally subjective. Yeah.
And then that's just so awful. Plus again, the encouraging of the lying and all that.
Yeah.
Chad says the interviewee should always have someone they choose be in the room during a private interview. I like that idea, Chad.
That's what I was hoping for when I took Tyler with me. I was hoping we could go in and kind of do this together and work through it together. But yeah, it was a separation from the get-go.
Yeah. Scott writes, I was late to the podcast, but I too was and felt very much alone when I was interviewed by my bishop at age 17 about my being gay. The whole experience leading up to my excommunication was devastating. Scott, I hope you'll come on Mormon Stories and tell your story if you feel comfortable, because so far I don't have any gay person talking about their experiences with their bishop or stake president or mission president. So, Scott, I welcome you to tell your story, and I'm really sorry for the pain you suffered, Scott. All right. Angela writes, even Elizabeth Smart came out earlier this year about the problem with abstinence-only teachings, as well as the way she felt in young women's after she was rescued when they talked like that to the young women. Yeah, all these messaging around licked cupcake, chewed gum, board with the hammer and the nail and the hole in the board. It just means anybody who's ever had any sexual experimentation ends up feeling like garbage,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Emily writes, no one wants the rotten apple on the ground. They want the apple up at the top of the tree. She says, complete BS. I always felt like the rotten apple, no matter how much I starved myself. Super sad, Emily. Sorry for the pain. And then I'll just add one more. Aaron writes, I had bishops who made me feel like the dirtiest creature alive for masturbating as a teenager, and a mission president who basically acted like, no big deal, just keep it under control. So Aaron is totally, again, illustrating the wide variability on this topic. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, this has been super useful, Anna. Your story is really powerful, and I can't thank you enough for sharing. Do you want to share any final comments or thoughts with our audience before we interview our next person?
No, just thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for listening. And this is a cathartic experience for me, I think, to talk about it, even though I kind of didn't want to. I felt like it was, the right thing for me to do. So.
Well, bless you. Bless you. Thank you so much.
John.
And I'll just want to thank all our listeners on Facebook Live for giving their comments and questions. The interactivity of this always makes it more interesting. It also provides validation, because we know, it's easy for people to come on and say, well, you just had one bad bishop or one rogue experience. But every single one of these interviews, we've got people saying, me too, or mine was worse. And that helps us get a real sense for the scale and the scope of the problem. So thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thanks to everyone for joining us. If you have a story about a bishop or stake president or branch president or mission president or whatever, please email us at mormonstories@gmail.com. We'd love to share as many of these stories as we can. Hopefully we can get the church to change. But we just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thanks for those who support Mormon Stories. If you love programming like this, please go to mormonstories.org, become a monthly donor. Your donations are tax deductible, and they keep the podcast alive, and they allow us to do what we do. And everybody is saying thank you, that you've been wonderful. And I'll just join them in once again saying thanks for sharing such an important topic with us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the support.
All right. All the best.
Thanks, John.
Take care, Anna.
Bye-bye.
Talk soon. Okay, bye. I'm really excited to be interviewing our fourth person today in this series. Her name is Lara. We've already had, actually, she's going by the name Lara. She's not using her real name, and she's not showing her face, and that's intentional because these issues are really sensitive. Sometimes people's emotional or physical well-being is at stake. Sometimes jobs or family relationships are at stake. And one of the things we know most about Mormonism is there's a huge potential cost at being open in public, including church discipline, including being ostracized from family, all sorts of reasons. And so Laura is the name this person is going by. And we want to welcome you, Laura, to Mormon Stories podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to just talk really quickly, explicitly about why you wouldn't want to use your name or your video image, just so that people can understand it very directly?
Well, specifically for me, I just wouldn't want to be recognized and be labeled as an anti-Mormon, someone who wants to bring anything down, where this is not my intention. My intention is just to bring attention to this specific problem that has affected me personally and a lot of people I've met who've told me their stories as well.
So you don't see yourself as an anti-Mormon?
No, I do not consider myself as such. A lot of people I love and are dear to me are members, and I wouldn't want them to feel like I'm out to get them at all. So
okay.
I am anonymous.
Well, we're really grateful that you would come on. All right. So if it's okay to begin with, why don't you just go ahead and share us just a little bit about your background, your story, as it relates to your Mormonism up until these interviews started.
Well, I grew up in the church and I was very, very devout, I would say. So I was preparing to be married in the temple at the time. And I'd known this bishop since I was a kid, grew up in this ward specifically. So yeah, I guess I was just very, very devout. Everything was very real and I took everything very, very seriously.
Okay, so very devout, Orthodox Mormon girl growing up.
Yes.
Okay, and then what happened?
Well, in the interview specifically.
So is this nothing had happened? You're just being interviewed? What type of interview is it?
Well, I had done a previous interview with him as far as just letting him know that I was engaged and looking to get I recommend to be sealed and get my endowments out and all that. So we had already done that interview. And so he was aware that that was my intention. And being young and obviously very into my fiance at the time, you could say that we slipped up.
Okay.
And so we both knew that we would have to confess. So he went first. He had a pretty good experience with his bishop, and that kind of gave me a little bit of courage to finally go in and see mine.
Mm-hmm.
So when I went in there, he was like, "Oh, this is unusual because you just came to see me. We'd already talked about everything. So you must be in here to confess something." And I just confirmed essentially that that's what I was there to do. And he assumed what it was. So
What do you mean? What do you mean he assumed?
He assumed that we had been having sex.
Okay.
So he kind of launched into his interrogation, essentially, and was trying to get some information out of me, very graphically asking me if I'd orgasmed, if we'd done anal, if we'd done oral, if he had fingered me, or just very, very graphically trying to get some information out of me. And by his approach, it became very, very difficult for me to even speak at that point. I was mortified. And
what's that like to have someone in an ecclesiastical position asking you such graphic questions?
Are there words for it? I couldn't even, I still don't even know how to describe that. It's mortifying. That's a decent word, I guess. But I mean, I'd known this man since I was a child, so, which added an extra layer of embarrassment, I suppose.
Sure.
And then also being unsure of what these kind of interviews ever were like. I mean, I'd never had to confess anything like that before. So, and I'd never been asked before in previous interviews with other bishops. So it was shocking. And so I didn't know how to respond. I didn't have any words. I was just bawling at that point. And he kept pressing me, and I may have given him some shrugs and nods along the way. And he kind of took my reaction as an admission of everything, I suppose. Because he then eventually he let me go after giving me a little stern talking to about how he believed my marriage would fail and he didn't approve of my fiance, and let me go after telling me I needed to go home and read, I don't remember which scriptures they were, but specifically the Strength of Youth pamphlet and the Miracle of Forgiveness, which I did. I went home and read everything and internalized everything.
How was the Miracle of Forgiveness for you as something to read?
I mean, I wasn't really thinking too much about it. I just kind of read through it. It wasn't, that specifically didn't impact me. I was just trying to get through it at that point.
Okay. So was there more to the story, or was that the basic story that you kind of wanted to tell?
Well, I did want to mention that eventually I was able to move my records into my fiance's ward, and work with his bishop at that point. And his bishop was great, very understanding, and helped us get ready and everything. And once we were able to, we sent out our invitations for the wedding, and we specifically sent a few to people in my old ward, first counselor to be exact. And he had told the bishop, and he showed him the invitation, like, look who's getting married, you know. And the bishop, then told him that I was not actually worthy to be in the temple, and that I must have lied to get my recommend, and that he went and told others in the ward that I had sent invitations out to that was the case, and that my wedding was going to be canceled. It eventually got back to my mom, who told me about what was going on, and we talked to my fiance's bishop about it, and he had gotten a call as well from the bishop, saying that I must have been lying to him to get the recommend, and he had said that was not the case. He knew everything, and he gave us our recommends in good faith. You know, it was all worked out, and my fiance's bishop felt it was very, very inappropriate, and reached out to the stake president about it, and kind of got him into some trouble, which I was grateful for, because I felt like he had my back, you know. So,
and that's so telling that you've got bishops fighting over what the right answer is, right?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think that some of them are so convinced that they have to, you know, follow the letter of the law, you know, just everything in the handbook, or possibly whatever they've been told in trainings with other people with bad ideas as well. It's all very messy.
Yeah, some of the comments that are coming in, I'll just share a few. Amy writes, thanks for sharing your story. I agree, this is something that's probably very hard to share, and so thank you for being willing to share something so painful. Richard writes, why do Mormons feel so afraid of their church? That's a really good question. Did you feel
I don't think it's so much afraid of the church as it is afraid of the consequences that's been drilled into your head since very young. You know, this was difficult for me because I felt like a fraud for really long after this, because I felt like maybe he was right, maybe I wasn't worthy, maybe God didn't even consider me married, you know, that I was basically just parading around and faking it. And it was very, very difficult because of the eternal consequences, I guess.
Right. Yeah, the shame and the self-loathing and the guilt can be really severe, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It took some time to unravel that, for sure.
Melissa calls it mental violation. Becky says, yep, it's awful. Becky says, Lara, you're doing a great job describing that horrific experience. Melissa writes, I'm so sorry for anyone who reads The Miracle of Forgiveness. I should add that there are members of the Kimball family who are fighting to get that book taken out of print.
I've heard that.
Yeah, we're
That's
talking
great.
about descendants of Spencer W. Kimball who feel like their grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather's book was very damaging, and they're asking the church to stop printing it, and for good reason.
Yes.
Heather writes, when you start crying in the interview, they think it's because you feel guilty about what you've done and
Yes.
not because you were mortified. Do you want to add anything to that?
Oh yeah, that's something that I've heard time and time again from others who've felt like they could share their stories with me, is that they even thought it themselves, that I must be feeling this way because I did something wrong. And we're talking like really horrible stories, like girls going in feeling like they have to confess to being raped and internalizing the guilt and being told that they are guilty. And that's just evil.
Yeah, totally. And then, of course, Melissa writes, so much for confidentiality. So you kind of think when you're going to the bishop that maybe he'll be respecting your confidentiality. But it sounds like if your bishop doesn't like you or what you're doing, that the bishop can just run around and tell whoever he wants what's going on.
As far as I know, there's nothing legally stopping him from doing so. It's just like you assume it, really. There's no reason to think that for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to tell about the story itself?
I think that's pretty much it.
How did this affect your faith in the church?
Oh, it definitely contributed to my eventually leaving, amongst a lot of other things. But it kind of...
How did it contribute?
Well, it set me on the path of just like really seeing that they could be wrong, and which led to other things like, oh well, if one bishop can go rogue, then how many other times have even higher up, prophets gone rogue and said things like the miracle of forgiveness, some things that are just like so obviously wrong. I just started seeing them, it's hard to unsee once you go down that road.
Totally. Has it affected your life since then? Have there been scars that has all this trauma, the sexual related trauma, kind of had its own scars in your life?
Well, it impacted earlier on in my marriage, feeling like when I was intimate with my husband, even when we were married, it felt wrong and dirty, and it was really difficult. It took years to kind of not feel that way anymore. But leaving the church did really, really help me to leave a lot of that behind. And now it doesn't bother me so much. It just bothers me for the sake of others, if that makes sense. It's just one story of mine amongst many others that hopefully by sharing can, make a difference.
Yeah, like all this guilt and shame just really can spoil the beautiful gift that healthy sexuality can be in someone's life. Even if we're talking about consensual marital intimacy, these years of trauma and guilt and shame and transgression can just so pollute and sour something that
you can't just turn it off, that sort of thing that's instilled in you since very young, and then going through, something possibly traumatizing. You don't just shake that off and go, well, I'm married now, everything's honky-dory. It just doesn't happen. You carry those with you for a long, long time.
Yeah, you do. And what I love is the fact that, life can be so hard, right? Why do we have to take some of the things that are just ambiguously positive, like healthy sexuality? Mm-hmm. Why do we have to spoil those very things that are just unambiguous goods? You know what I mean?
There's
And
so few of those.
and instead of sex just being this wonderful, healthy thing between a married couple, it's now something that you're traumatized over. And instead of just enjoying, you have to spend a good portion of your married life healing and recovering from the way you've been treated over the issue.
Yes.
And then all that's in a religious context where supposedly you're dealing with God's desires and wills for you.
Yes, your
It's,
eternal consequences of it, you know.
yeah. Yeah, it's so hard. And then I just love how radical, it should be just normal, but radical, this idea of it's not, for women, it's not just about managing the boy's passions or limiting what the boy can do or behaving in a way that is appropriate given that boys will be boys. What about just the idea that women should be empowered about their sexuality, that sex can be a healthy, powerful thing for a woman, and that men shouldn't be the brokers or the filters or the commentators on a woman's own sexuality.
Yeah, but when you have a leadership that's made entirely up of men, you know, they're not telling each other that. You need women to bring that to the discussion.
It's kind of like, as long as there's a patriarchy, we're going to have to deal with this type of stuff, right?
It seems so.
Yeah. Joyce asks, how were you affected by the temple ceremony, Laura?
Oh, that's a whole story in and of itself. It was also very traumatizing. The first time going through getting my endowments out, I was very, very close to not going the next week to be sealed, if that kind of conveys how
What was disturbing,
awful I felt.
without you having to say anything you're uncomfortable saying? What was hard about it? What was disturbing?
Well, the implications, because growing up, I'd always been told, you know, God loves you, you know, you're equal, and men and women, you know, it's just like, maybe you have different roles or whatever, but I'd always kind of been a little bit of a feminist growing up. So whenever I heard a lot of the sexist things and felt excluded from a lot of things in the church growing up, I kind of became fixated on the temple as sort of like a one day I'll get like pure doctrine, you know, none of that, the ideas of men mingled in scripture, you know, where I just thought I'd finally be vindicated. And then going through, it was basically felt like a confirmation that a lot of the ideas, the sexist things that I'd grown up experiencing and being angry about, it felt like they were the ones being vindicated. They were the ones, and all along they were right, and I just had to accept that I was secondary.
Yeah, and that's got to be devastating to women who are fighting to see themselves as equals in a largely patriarchal male world, right?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Great question, Joyce. Mike writes, worried about my granddaughters and grandsons being subjected to this. And honestly, I love the Mormon church in lots of ways, but I think people should be worried about their children and grandchildren. I was a counselor at Utah State University Counseling Center, and the number of college students and returned missionaries that spent over a decade tormented over sexual shame and guilt, porn and masturbation, being called addicts and going to 12-step programs just for masturbating once every 3 weeks was really good, disgusting and egregious. And not to mention the church teaching people to lie and all that stuff. I see this as every bit of it as an epidemic as the LGBT crisis in the church. It's just stuff that we don't talk about. And so I'm really glad that we're talking about it now.
I completely agree.
Misty writes, I'm 40 years old and still working through the shame of having a child at 15 in the church. I'm so sorry, Misty. Our heart goes out to you. Thank you for sharing. Becky writes, it's awful what they do to girls. I was convinced I was going to hell, would never be forgiven. I spent years with the mental torment imposed on me. And then she says she finally found Jesus. So good for you, Becky. If Jesus has helped you, good for you. Ashley writes, my bishop at my singles ward pulled myself and my roommates into his office at different times and announced what each of us were doing. It was his way of holding us accountable. That's incredibly disgusting and a terrible breach of confidentiality, Ashley. I'm so sorry you had that experience. Melissa writes that it's important for women to know that they can say no. And that's true. There's such thing as marital rape. And consent applies to marriage as much as it applies to the dating world. And that's thank you, Melissa.
I think there's kind of a culture in the church where you'll say yes to date with almost anyone. You can make a marriage work as long as everyone, as long as you have the church in common. So there's kind of like an obligation to try anyone on, basically. And so you may end up in situations that you otherwise would never have agreed to, where you feel like, this meekness is such a virtue, and naivety being a virtue, that you don't know how to stand up for yourself.
Yeah, meekness becomes the weapon they use against you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, your meekness that they nurture and encourage becomes the weapon they use against you.
Yeah. Joyce
writes, the temple in 1974 was their first step out of the church. That's true for a lot of people, Joyce.
True for me.
Melissa writes that she wanted to leave the temple during the endowment session, but felt like she couldn't. And that is another abusive situation, that you don't know what you're getting into, and then all of a sudden you have to, you get one chance before they tell you what you're committing to. You get one chance to leave, and then all of a sudden you're swearing your entire life and money and time and everything to the church, and that's just it's an abusive setup, plain and simple.
Mm-hmm.
Mary writes, the problem with bringing women into the confession interviews is that they would likely be church broke and possibly have a healthy attitude about sex, besides being in position second to the bishop, if that makes sense. Oh, so they're talking about, I think Mary's basically saying just bringing women into...
Like a Relief Society president, for instance, to be there during an interview.
Yeah, they could be just as abusive and even worse, right? What if you bring
very, very possible.
Yeah, what if you bring a woman in and she's totally like on the bishop's side? How would that feel, right?
Yeah, it could be worse.
If the bishop's being abusive, then it's just like worse. Yeah. That's a great point, Mary. Bringing women in the interview isn't enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
It needs to be a trusted person, really.
Needs to be a professionally trained person, and they just shouldn't ask those things, especially of minors. It just shouldn't be part of the discussion at all.
Totally agree. Well, Lara, this is a heart-wrenching story, and I can't tell you how thankful I am for your being willing to share it. Is there anything else you want to share with us before we wrap up this interview?
No, that's it. I think you're doing a great job, and I'm really glad that Sam Young has been bringing this up as well. So
everybody please go and sign the petition if you haven't. Sam wants to get it up to 10,000. I think that's very ambitious, but I think it's a noble effort.
How many are on Reddit right now?
How many signatures so far?
Yeah.
I think it's over 2,000, so we're getting there.
Yeah. Well, how many people are on Reddit, on Exmormon or Mormon?
Oh, yeah. Like 30 or 40 or 50,000, something like that.
Yeah, we could get that easy.
We should be able to get it. Yeah. So come on, everybody, go sign it. But more importantly, speak up at your local bishop, stake president, mission president. Protect yourself, protect your children. Don't let someone you love be interviewed by a Mormon bishop or stake president or mission president about matters of sexuality without support there.
Can I just say one thing?
Please.
Especially, this is really, really important for current members to be doing, because as ex-Mormons, we kind of get the shaft like, well, you're just trying to take it down or do anything you can to harm the church, which is not true. That's not at all what the goal here is. It's to protect people. And I think current members have a bit more weight to throw around in that regard.
Yeah, and that's super true. So everyone speak up, protect yourselves, protect their loved ones, sign the petition, speak out, share this podcast, whatever you have to do. Catherine writes, thank you. So many people are telling you. Melissa writes, thank you, Laura. Richard writes, thanks for a great interview. Laura, lots of people are just very grateful that you would speak up. So thank you for that. And I want to thank all our listeners for joining us and for providing questions and comments, because that makes these interviews more rich and interactive. Thanks for everyone who supports the Open Stories Foundation of Mormon Stories. If you value this stuff, please support us and donate, because that is what keeps all this alive. And if you have a story you want to share about inappropriate interviews with bishops or stake presidents or mission presidents or whoever, mormonstories@gmail.com. You can email us and we'll do our best to share it. And please always give us your feedback, because we really depend on it. All right, Laura, you're awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, bye.
And thanks everyone else for joining us. And we're gonna keep doing these. We've got 2 or 3 more. So just stay tuned on Mormon Stories Podcast Facebook page. We've got at least 2 or 3 more coming in the next 2 hours. So join us back again soon for another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody. Sure love you, and stay tuned.